So, my name is Sofia Soraci, and I'm a senior double majoring in sociology and anthropology on the global health and environment track. My honors thesis is titled Reproducing Social Inequality, the Social Drivers of Perinatal Shackling in the United States. So, this practice refers to the use of restraints on pregnant, laboring, and postpartum women who are incarcerated. And given how medically serious these conditions are, and that the majority of women in prisons and jails are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, I wanted to understand what implicitly motivates this practice. So I performed a manual content analysis where I first had to compile information about as many states as I could by searching through law databases, Department of Correction websites, and also emailing DOC contacts. And eventually I was able to find the protocols of 42 states. I then hand-coded these to answer both of my research questions. So my first research question is, what types of perinatal shackling laws currently exist at the state level? And to answer this, I had 12 different measurements. So, for example, is shackling permitted during the first trimester? Are leg irons allowed at any point during pregnancy? Or do officers have to file a report if they do use shackles? And then I created a coding scheme to assign numeric and descriptive value to each question so that I could both evaluate restrictions within states but also produce a comparative analysis among all states. My second research question is, how does the language and structure of this legislation reflect the treatment and perception of people who are incarcerated? And this was broken down into sub-themes of language, vagueness, and accountability, which each include their own set of questions. So the first theme I examined included person-first language, fetal references, and orientations to safety. So for example, I found that safety references occur 88 times across legislation to justify shackling. So most protocols will say something like restraints can be used during labor if an officer believes that a woman poses a threat to others, yet the dangers of shackling itself are only mentioned 10 times total, meaning that most policies do not acknowledge any risk related to the restraint of pregnant, laboring, or postpartum women. And then I looked at accountability measures. So one variable within this theme was the frequency in which correctional staff appears in comparison to medical staff. And what I found is that carceral officers are mentioned about 400 times and medical staff are referenced about 270 times, which implies that perinatal shackling is understood as a punitive rather than a medical concern. And finally, I examined vagueness in regards to pregnancy, labor, and postpartum recovery, and how the definitions of these conditions served as a legislative loophole. So for example, while Florida technically has strong restrictions on postpartum shackling, their protocol defines this period as up to 24 hours as opposed to the medically recommended minimum of 4 weeks. Ultimately, my study highlights how perinatal shackling legislation is structured to fail women because most restrictions can be easily overridden at the subjective discretion of carceral officers who likely will not be held accountable. Protocols also criminalize women and portray them as undeserving of their Eighth Amendment right to adequate health care and protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Perinatal shackling legislation also literally changes the definitions of universal medical conditions so that pregnancy, labor, and postpartum recovery are treated as inferior and less serious when they occur inside prisons and jails. Overall, this practice is incredibly unnecessary and inhumane, and the justifications used to defend it are unsubstantiated. So the results of my study suggest that perinatal shackling is not a security measure, but rather is a result of compounding racial, gender, and class inequalities. And finally, the legislation that is theoretically meant to protect women by restricting this practice only perpetuates discrimination and actually facilitates the use of restraints.